Let's talk about S3 Expedition to the Barrier Peaks by Gary Gygax with Rob Kuntz. I'll answer that question immediately. Is it with Rob Kuntz? It's only credited to Gygax, but he does mention immediately here that Kuntz provided lots of the encounters. And there's a legitimate question with Gygax during the TSR period about whether or not something under his name is by him. I say that because Oriental Adventures is solely credited to him, when probably 90% of it was actually by his those people he credits as helps, Frodoval and Cook. Here, I don't think we have that problem. He never really fails to be interested in crediting Kuntz, and the situation seems pretty clear from what he says here. It's his map from a Castle Greyhawk submodule, and he's got his friend to come up with some extra encounters for him for the scenario they ran at Origins 2, 1976. This is published 1980, so it's fairly late in the run of the great Gygax modules of the late 70s and early 80s. It's technically a sort of soft launch or tie-in to Metamorphosis Alpha, or at least it's inspired by that, which was Jim Ward, another Gygax friend, his sci-fi game or sci-fantasy game from TSR in the 70s, which is about a colony ship gone wild. That the PCs are people who don't really understand. They've grown up and they don't understand the background of it, and they've got to decode, or that, at least they've got to influence things in a technological world they don't understand. And here we have, as you can see with the great Otis cover, we have fantasy heroes on Greyhawk going onto a spaceship. Basically, the setup is roughly that a segment of a crashed spaceship has landed, or was already in the Duchy of Jeff, and I think it's at a landslide, reveals a bit, and it activates some systems. Some creatures come out of it and are harassing the locals, and you got to go in and sort it out. Classic stuff in that sense in terms of Monster Cave. It's not, I would say, it's science fiction, science fantasy perhaps, inclined in some ways. It's not Gonzo. Gonzo is the big, ridiculous, significantly comedic, constantly shading into that. And there are moments of that here, but compared to, say, Anomalous Subsurface Environment, which is very much in this tradition, this is much straighter and much more interested in using the tropes of sci-fi than ASE is on the whole, I would say. The real, kind of actually more serious tropes of sci-fi, even though it is not hard sci-fi whatsoever. The science is held very lightly. It's for levels 8 to 12. I think it suggests 10 or more characters. It's a classic big module, big parties, average level 10. So it's high mid-level. We're not quite at the point of true high-level modules, of course. There's very few true high-level modules at any point really published officially, in terms, particularly in AD&D we're talking about here, and I think that's an interesting thing in itself that's worth talking about, potentially with another review I'll do soon of a more high-level module. But yeah, it's fairly high-level. It's definitely on the challenging side, and it's meant to be. It's pretty dangerous. It is useful to see it as a dungeon as opposed to as a spaceship. What I mean is that's how it works. Mechanically, there is, I'll just flick through, this is kind of the booklet with the levels. You can see Flying Saucer, 6 levels. There's a top level which is living quarters and major services. There's a sub-level, then there's a lounge area, then there's a botanical garden, then there's another sub-level, and then there's a recreation activity area. And those are 6 dungeon levels, and you can get through them in different ways, and in that sense it's comparable to Gygax's other bigger dungeons, so Lost Caverns of Sojkanth, or Forgotten Temple of, so that's S4, WG4, Forgotten Temple of Tharasdon, or T1 to 4 Temple of Elemental Evil. It's comparable to those in terms of there are lots of areas to go, and we're not talking, it's a single concentrated location, I think, is the way to think about it. And I think because we can compare it to other dungeons and other large dungeons by Gygax, that's where we see very significant differences in design, which make this, I think, such a triumph. I will argue this is one of his very best. There is this is only the lower section of the craft, and it's explicit that there are some things that aren't on it. So charging points for certain kinds of robots and suits and stuff, there are things where you're like, oh no, you'd have to go to the rest of the spaceship. There's no reason you couldn't put that on Greyhawk. In fact, as soon as I look at this, I'm like, yeah, you should do that. That should definitely be something where the different parts crash in different places. I'm not going to run through the levels in a kind of straight kind of way. I think it's better to sum up design themes for this one to try to draw out what's interesting and where it perhaps struggles more. One general point, by the way, is as with any module from the 70s or 80s, you may or may not, your mileage may vary on 2-column, 10-point or whatever it is. You may need to highlight. It's not horrendously overwritten. You're still talking about something where Gygax is fitting on 6 or 7 rooms on a page. But it's definitely denser, and you have to pick up a degree of know-how about the layout. To be like, but then again, because it's so short, it's 32 pages for the main booklet, and then 32 pages for the 32 pages for the illustration booklet. But yeah, I think it's something where you definitely need to know where things are before you're running it, or else you'll be looking at the text in a blank manner eventually. The first thing is, and I think this relates to the general way that this is a themed module. This is Lost Caverns of Sojkamp is kind of the opposite. It's a classic. It's really the monster zoo of Gygax's oeuvre, along with keeping the Borderlands, the Caves of Chaos. But it's the place where he just says, here's a bunch of stuff. This is fun, isn't it? Oh, how would these things interact? Oh, how'd you get from this to this? Here's a puzzle. And those are one end where there is very loose theming for both of those on the whole. At the other end, obviously, though they're under-detailed, him and Mensa's nodes, they're his nodes. He always had nodes in the Temple of Elemental Evil. And that's pretty themed. They're elementally themed, and you can see that mapping to a tiny degree, to a small degree to the temple above. That's kind of at the other end where you're like, oh, there's some level theming, and you can certainly see this in plenty of modules over the years where levels have themes. I talked about this in Castle Zinterland review. One thing is that over-theming can create a sort of funhouse feel in a peculiar way, because though it seems naturalistic that an area has a really strong theme, it can become too rote and too much like this is a game, and this is something where this is just flavoured, and it's a flavoured game rather than an environment. And this mostly straddles the line, I think, pretty well. It is strongly themed, the living areas, the mysteries. There are mysteries around how to access things and get around, learning some of the environmental rules, kind of finding the stuff that people might have stored in their rooms, dealing with the headquarters of maintenance and police robots, things like that, domestic care oriented stuff. Then you go to the Botanical Garden, and you've got this very different, incredibly strongly themed kind of animal and plant-based thing, and things going on there. And then you've got in the exercise area, you have kind of quite interactive experiences of exercise, activity, etc. And it's in that sense, it has a. Do you know what it reminded me of upon reread? Of all things, and it's not a strong similarity apart from the fact it's a ruined science fiction-y environment, but BioShock. The idea that the kind of zones in the original BioShock have some sort of sense of, this connects to this. The other thing is something like, this is the theme and story of an area. The other place, maybe even more so, are experimental dodgy vaults in Fallout. Oh wow, they're all Garys. The plants have taken over. That sort of thing. There is a degree of that where you can see that what you've got is the base concept taken to a very high level. The base concept of an area taken to a high level, and it's mostly pretty successful. There are, and it has internal logic. The activity decks, these weird exercise robots or androids that are annoying you. Well, of course they'd be there. The animals that are around are really dangerous, and the plants are around are really dangerous because they are the fittest survivors of what has been a hermetic environment until the landslide. So I can see that that makes sense. And there are breaches, and the breaches are good, when you say, oh, okay, so this just random thing is in a different place, or this is here, and, these have escaped from the menagerie and gone to a different area. There are logical in-world explanations why they are like that, and it just breaks. Mostly, I think it's a good thing. You want the theming, but you don't want it to be pervasive in the sense of so total that you can never escape the sense that you are in an area of a theme park. I think that's well-measured theming helps environments feel organic, but not rote. And this does feel organic. And that helps offset, this is an important thing about organicity, it helps offset the weird new stuff. This has a lot of weird new stuff. This was both in its original airing in 1976, but more importantly on its release in 1980. This is an enormous resource in terms of, only a relatively small number of androids, robots, Veggie-Pygmy, russet mold. So you only have technically 5 new monster stat blocks, but you have a bunch of monsters being introduced and discussed, not necessarily for the first time, but they had been created for this module originally. So for instance, the lurker above, I think, was created for this, but is in Monster Manual from 1977 before this is released. There's lots of new things going on here, lots of invention, lots of things like all the killer plants and stuff, and all the tech as well. And I'm going to talk about the tech separately, but the organicity means the weird new stuff doesn't feel piled on top of itself, each other, just for kind of, again, as in a monster zoo-ish kind of way. And an example of where you can feel like stuff is piled next to each other in the course of invention is, and I've reviewed this, Pass of the Vampire Queen, the first published module by TSR, because what I mean there is what you find is there's all these cool ideas and things and interactions, not necessarily new monsters, but kind of new ways of looking at stuff and putting stuff in the module that the designers have thought of. But it's just next to each other. There's no real sense of an organic whole. And this does have that, and that means that the new tech and the new monsters and the new situations that are being set up are interesting. And so it's more to the world, basically, as well, because there's a familiarity to this is a slightly different point, but worth making. When I say that the weird new stuff is grounded, it's also grounded by being in D&D. There being ways to engage with it as these fantasy heroes on the cover, and the environment being organic, making sense, and also in some ways resembling a dungeon. And I know that's a more meta comment, but helps players engage with this very different environment as they go from Greyhawk to a sci-fi environment, and they have to learn about it as they go. But it is possible to do that rather than simply bemusing, and I think that's a really good thing. And the way in which things are moored and connected brings me to, this is more a small point really, but when I think about Rob Kuntz being the co-author really, or the additional author, it makes me think of Kuntzian depths and the fact that this is a module that has a number of things going on that connect across the dungeon. The Kuntzian depth is one where something in room 7 connects to something in room 101, and that actually is connected to the sub-level and the dimensional rift. And you can and something like ASE, for instance, is very good at doing that in terms of more modern modules. And you see that with Kuntz, you see it a tiny bit here. As I say, I've already kind of suggested that. You see it in WG5, Mordenkainen's Fantastic Adventure. You see it in his post-TSR modules, and I'm thinking about, I have them, Garden of the Plant Master, and whatever that other, the series of 4 is called. There's the 4 little modules that go together, which, and yeah, you can see that he's really interested in stuff connecting across within a module and between, in module series, between kind of areas in the wider adventure. He would have probably, and you can see influence, maybe it's his influence on Gygax, but you see that come up in things like Temple of Elemental Evil, and probably Kuntz would have been a maybe less reliable but more interesting completer for either Temple or Queen of the Demon Web Pits, the end of the Giants and Drow series, because in those what you can sometimes feel is lacking is a vision of connectedness and kind of creativity. In Kuntz, the way in which encounters connect is really good. So for instance, in one thing there is an intellect devourer that you can find out about from one place, I think on the top level, and the intellect devourer is on the first sub level below that. But then there is a solution or potential solution below that again, which is that if you let the coatls out, who, to be fair, they are on the first level, sub-level 2, they could go and deal with the intellect devourer, who you found out about from the top level, but they could deal with the intellect devourer, or they could, because they're so grateful to you, or they could deal with the web birds on the botanical gardens below, who are really annoying. And so wouldn't you want them to do that instead? Well, that's a possibility. You get to choose. But there's a cost benefit here, because there is, I think, it does list how many of the coatls, the smaller ones, get killed if they go off to fight stuff. And then, given they can also heal you as a one-off, that reduces the amount to which they can do that. So, you know, there's this whole strategic thing on a multi-leveled, multi-layered basis. Or again, the ropers in the lounge similarly plague the botanical gardens below them, just like the web birds do, in fact. The lake in the botanical gardens, so pretty much directly below where the ropers are preying, that is beginning to create a swamp due to some tech issues, which means stuff isn't draining, I think. And that can be discovered on the sub-level below that, like on the second sub-level. And there's a few other examples of that, but where you have not just connections between one level, but across many levels, and things where there are moving parts. There's none of the really big, exhaustive puzzles you might really think of in terms of Kuntzian depths, or very lateral connections. The key in room 7 connects to the door in room 107, that kind of thing. There's not really stuff like that on the whole, but there are things which make you think in terms of that style. There is a lot of, and I mentioned this with the coatls, there's lots of factional possibility here, which is something, I don't know if you'd come to the sci-fi module, the Metamorphosis Alpha module, and think, wow, at last we have a factional book. You'd assume that something like Temple would be more like that. And Temple has a bit of that, but is actually weaker than it should be. You would think something like, obviously Caves of Chaos and B2 definitely does have that. But this really has to be at least as good as any of those in terms of the potential factional possibilities. Not necessarily in a massive Rube Goldbergian sense, which I think B2 does have. You know, I've allied with these three people in a way that will create a Mexican standoff, and then there'll be a Yojimbo thing over here where I've made them fight each other and then I take their stuff. It's not quite so much that, but there is just a lot of interesting flavorful stuff. That's the other thing. It's very flavorful due to the new stuff principle. So you've got wild animals and monsters. You've got 2 Veggie-Pygmy tribes on the top level. Then you have a few potential intelligent allies. You've got the coatls. You can let out a stasis. They'll help you. The horrible plant, who's not actually horrible and just wants to be your friend but looks really dangerous. There are some Shadu on the bottom level who will help you versus the Mind Flayer, etc. There's baboonoids. There's a trapped android who might help you as well. You have intelligent evil monsters. So the Mind Flayer, the Eye of the Deep, he's in the swimming pool on the activity level of all things. 2 different groups of doppelgangers, and there's really detailed instructions about how one group of doppelgangers will screw you over, which is very good wargaming advice. You've got security and worker robots. You have androids. And there are a whole set of keys that allow different interactions with the robots and androids, you know, like key cards which show your rank on the ship. There are also different needs that factions have. So the robots and most of the androids, so far as they will interact with you, interact based on the cards. But the other factions, the organic factions, the biological factions, want different things. The coatls don't want anything because they're in stasis, but if you let them out, they're grateful. They can offer you different things, as I've discussed. The Shadu want just help escaping, and then they'll help with the Mind Flayer. The baboonoids, if you kill some shambling mounds, they'll send some scouts with you. These are good, and yeah, without necessarily being super deep or broad, and you can imagine some more complicated interactions than that. Players always throw up new possibilities. At the same time, I think there is a lot to be said for the fact that those are all interesting, fun, interactive parts of an otherwise very dangerous environment. This is a deadly module. There's plenty of stuff where the factual players are bringing two characters each is going to be necessary, and that is incidentally addressed in the pre-gen character block at the back. What does it say? It is suggested the players be allowed no more than 2 characters each. They may find it difficult to manage more than that number and may not be able to identify with such instant characters. That's a really interesting observation about the assumptions of early D&D. There are 15 potential PCs here between levels 5 and 12. There's a level 12 fighter with strength 15 and 54 HP who sounds very dangerous, and a bunch of magic items. But the point is that the point I was making is that because this is dangerous, and because characters are going to die, because as a tournament module originally, I assume there was a scorecard. You're talking about something where this is a challenging module, but putting in those helpful things gives players ways both that it allows them to roleplay, which is one of the pillars, but also allows them to break the environment open. One way that PCs can break an environment open one way is magic items, tech, whatever else, and the other way is alliances. And far too many modules miss that it's interesting for players to get to work their way around problems rather than having to face them. Why not have the coattels go and kill stuff that's annoying you? So the environment is organic as well. So we've said this, it's organic, and it offsets some of these other things, to the weird and wonderful menagerie stuff and the new tech. It offsets that. But it's also, the interactions are organic, and I've described some of them. Lots of things interact across between levels. The dungeon is very open to player activity, and that's, again, seeing it as a dungeon helps us see that, oh, it's a dungeon that is open to player activity rather than a spaceship, a sci-fi setting. There are internal limits based on stuff like how many battery packs you get, how many charges they have, because virtually all the new tech needs battery packs. But there isn't gimping. There is a reasonable degree of non-linearity in the map. So, for instance, there's 4 drop tubes, 2 of which work as anti-grav tubes, one of which you can still use as a sort of escalator, basically, and the other of which you can't use in any tech way, but you can just climb up and down. You can use drop tubes. There are a few hatches. There's a hole in the floor in one place. The lounge, because it's a balcony, means you can just, I guess, if you really want to, jump over, but more realistically, fly or climb into the botanical garden. And there's also 4 drop tubes, as I say, which means there isn't. When you think about it, it means there are 4 entrance points. I'll try to show that one. You can see basically those circles: north, south, east, west. The maps are blue two-tone, as you'd expect from the era. That kind of allows them to get away because they can use black with black on blue as light coding. The maps having light encoding where it's relevant is good, and I appreciate it. It's not always terribly clear to see. You can see another couple of levels with light codings on them. I.e. on-off lit area where you use the switch, brightly lit area, unlit area, and it can also have a dimly lit area. So yeah, I mean, that's a downside, but the actual maps are, as I say, they're non-linear on the levels themselves. They're quite open, literally quite open environments, and the access between them is good on the whole. So, and that's good. The maps and the ways the levels interact make a good looping, non-linear, open dungeon. Though it's not necessarily, I mean, yes, a Mind Flayer and Eye of the Deep on the bottom level are some of the most dangerous things in the dungeon. But at the same time, it's not strictly that level 1 is not that dangerous and level 6 is the most. There's plenty of stuff all along that can kill you. But there is a degree of learning that comes through that. So you go into the top level where there's all the key card stuff is a lot more obvious, and some of the weird stuff starts to come out. But it's in a way a fairly dungeony environment with these different bedrooms and offices and stuff. And I think that the way that the spaceship opens out as you go through the levels and the ways in which the stuff interacts becomes more complicated to a degree. But not necessarily strictly in terms of danger. There's still the question of what's actually filling up the space, because what's really the selling point, I think, is, I've given lots of things I like about it, but what's really the selling point is the detailed content, the sci-fi theming, the massively inventive range of monsters and technology. And so I'll split that into 2 general categories: monsters / encounters, and technology. And that's kind of the bulk of what I want to talk about with the remaining time I'll take. There is a really significant amount of of invention here, and it's a really significant moment of invention in the history of D&D. I've already said that. A lot of monsters appear here for either the first time or they were invented here, even if they've appeared in the monster manual. So in terms of the monsters themselves, you have lots of invention. Quite aside from the ones where there is a mini monster manual at the end, there are plenty of other creatures in there, as I think I'll mention some in a moment actually. But there's also a degree in which the monsters as presented, they're obviously unique because the setting, the sci-fi setting, is very, very different to Sojkamp. For instance, it's not just a set dressing level where, oh well, you know, it's still the same kind of dungeons, still the same kind of monsters, but they've all got green paint on, which is a legitimate tactic. Reskinning monsters is a way to help players engage with them in a new way, in the same way that describing monsters in quite physically descriptive ways forces players to try to work out what they are. Reskinning can be good as well, but this isn't a reskin thing. Obviously it's not because it's so early, but also it really is inventive and at an angle to other works of the period. It's different to Gygax's fantasy modules. The environment feels different, and the monsters feel different, and the encounters feel different, despite the fact the rules are the same. This isn't a system modelled for sci-fi action, but for fantasy adventure. Gygax and Kuntz, instead of, you know, so it's not something where there are fantasy adventures in a sci-fi setting. It is actually that they've managed to sew up this sci-fi setting with the fantasy rule set quite well, I think. Some encounters, which I think will have felt fresh at the time, don't excite me now I read them. So the Lurker Above, it's a classic Lurker Above trap with some interesting stuff on the floor. There's something above. Even in 1976, players who'd played D&D before, any of them that had a legitimate level 9 character when they turned up at Origins 2, those players knew that was a trap. It's not really like that was not a trap, but the creature, the way it worked, was a surprise. And that's something which, if your players have never encountered a Lurker Above in any way, if they don't know anything like that, then maybe it's not effective. But it's certainly not, it's not on its own an incredibly novel moment now. It doesn't keep its freshness. It was a moment of literal novelty, not of long-term innovation. But others, and I should say others, work in the context. Maybe that's a second category. Some work in the context of this, at the level of science fantasy presented here. You know, there's the exercise androids on the bottom level, and they're kind of fun. I'm thinking particularly there's these three kind of personal trainer ones, and the first one is a boxing and wrestling trainer. The second is a fencing instructor, and the third is the karate master. And they each fight you in different ways, but you can also make the karate master really angry and go and fight and destroy the boxing trainer. And they're kind of funny, and they work here, and they wouldn't work somewhere else. They would feel unfortunate, I think, in a fantasy module if you had fantasy equivalents. You know, like three magical knights who did the same thing would actually work less well than in a Technicolor sci-fi module. But a number of the encounters are just really quite good. They're both innovative, new, novel, but they're also innovative in the sense that they create, you know, you read them and you play them, and they are a new thing, even if you know things like them. So the Froghemoth appears here for the first time, I think. It lives in the lake. It won't be immediately spotted, as in I think it was created for this module. I think it appears in a monster manual before this. But it lives in the lake. It won't be spotted immediately, but you might see moving plants on the water, which are actually its eye stalks or whatever. You might see a flash of it when you're in the aquarium section underneath the lake. If you turn on some lights, it'll start smashing into the window. If you go out in the oxygen suits, if you work them out, then it may be waiting for you. It's atmospheric, it's dangerous, it's cool. And it's something where I don't look at that and think, oh, well, it's a monster in the deep story. Of course, everyone knows that one. It's something where the way it's written, the way it's presented, you still think, yeah, that's going to be an interesting encounter for my players. They're going to have to work their way out of that because of the way in which you have the multi-level presentation of what's going on. There's the lake encounter key, and then there's the there's the section underneath, and there's what happens when, which includes tech, and then there's the section as you go out, yeah, there's similarly that the fact that there are high prizes for that. An unassisted diver may find 1 gem per turn of 100 GP base value, but then there's a bunch of other stuff too. So there is a high reward potentially for dealing with, well, there is for dealing with this frog hemoth. So you also have not just the cool encounter, it's quite atmospheric, but also the players get rewards. There's loads of gems, there's loads of other equipment. The general feel of several of the areas and the way they're populated works really well, and lasts well without simply being a gimmick, I think. So the botanical garden around the lake and the lake itself with the frog hemoth in general work really well. Probably the strongest area, full of nasty creative stuff. Like there is, this sounds dumb, but from the menagerie, one of the survivors is an Ormvorax, who's this vicious honey badger type creature. And that just is a cool monster. It doesn't need to be anything more than basically a dangerous wild animal. But you're like, that's new, that's this golden animal in this semi-wild but cultivated environment. That's good. All kinds of unpleasant plants, including, and it's a gag, but the horrible plant is one of the unpleasant plants listed on the map, who ends up wanting to be your friend and will warn you about the other plants. But the triflower frond, and there's a sawgrass plant and things like that. Just stuff you'd expect to be there, but I would say stuff you can definitely transport. All of those pretty much have been used elsewhere, statted elsewhere in later years. And I think dangerous plants are an underrated tool in D&D. But I think, that is a whole environment which is organic and has good encounters and good interactions. And there's also tech solutions scattered through there. Particularly there's this defoliant spray, which you think, okay, if you can work that out, and we'll get to that, if you can work out the defoliant spray, that becomes a whole solution to this area. But it involves a different minigame and subsystem within the setting. The encounters on the top level, as I've said, they often work around what key card you have, what rank you effectively are. They're not in themselves necessarily special, but they work very well within the context, and they do connect to the separate issue of how the tech is presented in the module. The veggie pygmies are invented in this module, and they have, along with the thornies, they get their first presentation in the back. And I guess they will turn up in, is it Dwellers of the Forbidden City? Is that what I'm thinking about them also being? They're really good fun, particularly in so much as they are, this is the thing I love, they are a neutral sentient monster who is created originally, they may be able to breed later or bud off, but they are created originally by a mould that kills people. A bad thing, but they are just their own sentient, neutral thing. They're not out to kill anyone. One of the tribes has little dog things. That is vivid and memorable, and players will, generally speaking, I think, like that. Most players like weird, kooky, cute stuff. Not everyone, but most do. And a number of the special encounters are really good. The baboonoids, the shadu, I've already mentioned. They're not even incredibly crazy inventions. They're a bit like baboons. Is not an incredibly inventive thing, but the way it's set up, and the idea that that's this faction in this massive botanical garden with all kinds of things, that if you can work out how to interact with lots of that, actually, like the shadu certainly are like this, and the horrible plant is like this, where players need to be open to being friendly and not aggressive. In fact, with the shadu and the horrible plant, I think in both those cases it's very explicit they have to be like that. And so they can be, if they are friendly, they can make friends and alliances. It's something that arguably lacks in ASE, which I really like. I think it's a great science fantasy module. But there is a degree to which there is a relentless hostility to large sections, not the whole, but large sections of the 3 levels presented. Not so much the gatehouse, where there is actually kind of a faction of robots you can become friends with, but below, 90% of it is hostile, if not more, whereas here there is constantly a sense that amidst the crazy deathly stuff, I've already mentioned this, if you're friendly, the encounters might turn your way. One final note, I think, on mundane monster design, on the kind of generally the way he sets this stuff up, or Kuntz does, Interestingly, very few of the monsters here are magic resistant or have mundane damage immunity. The Shadu, the Mind Flayer, they will, a few others will, but most of them don't. Most of the monsters, most of the plants, they are basically mundane creatures themselves. The robots are not magical, they are technological, so they don't have special magical, they have resistance to some magic by dint of being mindless, but not because they are magical creatures. And that's really interesting because in an 8th to 12th level module, how common is it that, yeah, cool, they're fighting some shambling mounds. There's baboonoids. How often is it in an 8th to 12th level module that most of the monsters do not have straight MR and damage immunity? So you can cast your spells without worrying about them fizzing, and you can hack them to death with a +0 with an non-magical sword. Though by that time you're going to have magical items, and I think the sample characters, to be clear, just basically all do have magical weapons, as you'd expect. I say that 12, a druid, a neutral druid, has a robe of blending as their only magical item. But I guess they can shillelagh, can't they? But yeah, you get the point. It's something where that is a really interesting design choice, and it's not a risk, I think. It's not like they're not challenging. Instead, there are different problems. So, for instance, the robots and androids, many of them are immune to cold. Some of them are immune to mind-affecting magic. They may reduce other damage, but be more vulnerable to other types. There you've got to learn a different set of resistances and skills rather than simply going for the highest level plus weapon you have, or hoping to break through the MR of an MR resistant creature. At this point, I'm trying to think. Obviously, psionics will exist here, and the Mind Flayer, I think, is detailed with psionic powers. So there is that comes into it, but how often, unless you're mind blasting under first edition psionics, you're not doing very much. You could use your disciplines, obviously, or your minor powers, I mean. Vegapigmies, they're immune to piercing damage. They take 1 damage, I think, at most. So you can hack stuff, and that isn't a bad solution, but sometimes it will come up short. Sometimes you're just dealing with very high hit point creatures. This is part of it, I think police robots have 60 hit points standard. That is more than any sample PC, and they've got good AC. So -1 for robot police, 2 for worker robots. Vegapigmies have AC 4 with hit dice 1 to 6, but loads of them appear at once. You know, you get the general picture. You are either talking about numbers with things like the Vegapigmies, if for some insane reason you decide to fight them, or with androids and robots, high AC, high hit points. So you can hack them to death, you can magic missile them, and that, as a specific case, would work because they're not resistant to it. But you can't sort of brute force them in the way that you might hope quickly. You've got to learn how they're vulnerable, just like you would with a magical monster, but here the resistances, the difficulties are different. The big damage options, this is the thing, that you need big damage options, but ones that bypass those problems, and that's where we come to the tech. There are problems in the world that are resolved by solutions in the world, or at least they are efficiently solved by solutions in the world. I think the technology here is not just an obvious differentiating factor as a thematic thing, but is also its own category of ludic challenge. It is its own thing in terms of, if we see D&D as something where players have to learn excellence, they have to become good at a game, not to win in, though of course this is a tournament module, will have potentially, or almost certainly had winning conditions, but the sense that there is a way in which you become a better player, not by experiencing a bigger story, but by learning how to play the game better, by solving problems more efficiently, by having better systems for things. This is a module that really leans into that, really emphasises the players becoming good at the stuff they're doing, or at least working out what's going on. What I mean is there are environmental puzzles to unpick and use, the drop tubes, the water supply to the lake, that sort of thing. There are ways the tech monsters, androids and robots, work and can be interacted with or can be damaged. how they can be tricked, suborned. There are monsters here that don't have magic resistance, but there aren't magic items here either. Just immensely powerful technology. So the twist is this: the players do not know what the technology is or how it works. The players will not automatically recognize stuff, and I'll talk about that in a second. And the module really heavily leans into the fact that these are not though player knowledge is often rewarded by Gygax. He's completely fine with it. Read some of those DMG notes on some of the ways of solving problems. On the other hand, I think there was obviously a degree of metagaming he opposed to do with attempting to break systems, not to solve problems, but to break systems. And here, he does that in two ways. The illustrations booklet is generally okay. There's some decent Dave LaForce, and I think there's some Otis. There is an Otis robot. So, you know, there's some really good illustrations in there. I am not as much of a fan of illustrations booklets as some people. I like it as a extra thing, and it has a colour section. Who can complain about that? The robots make me think a lot of 2000 AD, at pretty much exactly the time this was published, 1980. When you look at those early 80s, 2000 AD robots in Mega City 1. But anyway, here we go. There are, oh dear, there are some robots throwing out a boulette some robots throwing out a boulette for you to fight outside the spaceship. There are boulettes on here, on the ship. But yeah, it's the tech that interests me here, and something where I probably would want to use this as an aid. So for instance, what are those? Or again, what's that? Or those? Or, yeah, we'll go for that one. What are those two devices? And I think there might be one more good one. No. There's a description, actually not a picture, of the defoliant spray one. Is like obviously it's a Ghostbuster backpack. So you've got things where you look at these things, you're going to show the players these things, and some of them look weird and unusual, and it's not clear what they are. And players will correctly want to know what they are. But the most dangerous things here, the weapons they really want, the most powerful weapons, are these, the blasters. Look at this thing. That's weird, isn't it? There is a separate picture of how it fits on in the main booklet, of how it fits on to the wielder. And I guess it's a heat ray sort of thing. The laser pistol and the using VR goggles and the laser rifle. And then these things, well, that's a needle gun and that's a paralysis gun. The fact that they do not look, I mean, they look to different degrees, like they might be a gun or something. But whereas on the other hand, that is a universal translator, which actually looks like a gun and has triggers. Gygax is intentionally screwing with players. He is saying, look, this isn't familiar. You don't get to cheat by saying, I see something that looks a bit like a gun, do I? Oh, I mean, sorry, a crossbow, but without a bolt. Okay, well, I'm going to pull the trigger and see what happens. Oh, no, that was actually just a translator. That was a defoliant spray. Whereas the stuff, you know, the weird things with weird buttons that look like they might be scanners, they are incredibly dangerous weapons. And that's clever. This doesn't... How do players learn to use it? There are two ways. One is you let them work it out. And I don't think this excludes that. I don't think this module excludes the possibility that a player says, I put it on and I do this. In fact, given there are descriptions about what happens when players do it in the text section, you have to assume that he envisions that. You know, you can see the pictures for how things work and how they look. And it's kind of fun seeing what, can I get it up? What laser guns look like, you know, very RoboCop. But the other thing is he adds this subsystem, this mini game, which is, you see these accounting flowcharts. The flowcharts are basically a thing where you roll a die. It is a D8, is it? A D10, and you modify it by int. So usually that's a negative modifier to make it lower, which is good. If you're really stupid, you add to it. If you're really clever, you take away from it. If you have seen a similar object, you take away from it. if you've had an exploration of operation of item by someone familiar with it, you take away from it. And if you've operated a similar but non-identical item previously, then you get 1. So it's all cumulative. You're looking to get low scores to progress around the flow chart. Finish, I take it, means that you've worked it out, and then you can instruct other people. But you might waste a charge, you might destroy the item on any of them, even the most basic ones, and you might hurt yourself. And the options are simple non-lethal, complex non-lethal, simple lethal, complex lethal, and it gives bold text examples on there. So here, for instance, and that's fun, it's clever. I don't actually look at it and think, man, that's so exciting as a way to do it, but I think it is functional, and it is a way that I think players would accept. If players do not know what they are doing, and they're like, what is this? How can I work it out? You could get them to int check and just say, oh, well, roll under your int to succeed. But of course, you might be tempted to make it more than one check. And what this does is just gives you a formalized way of letting them know how it's going, and sort of creating a process. It's not all that's completely clear, but it's easy enough to pick up. And I think that's interesting that that Gygax thinks that having a system for these fancy PCs to work out these pieces of tech, that's good to know that he thought that was a good idea, because it shows that he is seeing the sewing up of the two genres as a culture clash thing, and that you really want to emphasize that to your players. The attraction, though, is I've said about, oh, well, it's fun that they can work out how it works, or they can use this perfectly usable subsystem, but the real fun is how they're presented, both how players will find them, what they look like, the fact that they have incredibly high power levels. And remember, that's one thing, is players will be tempted to think, what if I could keep some of this, even if I don't have a renewable resource, but especially because I don't have a renewable resource, what if I could keep the blaster pistol that does 5d6 damage, and there is a save versus petrifaction. If you save and you're unarmored, you take half damage, so call it essentially 5d3. If you're armored, you take no damage, but you have to save for your armor as well. So if you fail, you just take the full damage, but if you save, bad stuff happens if you're in range. So it's an auto hit weapon, basically. The blaster rifle, much more powerful, has the heat beam, the disruption beam, and the flame beam, the flame plane. So it just has different options for different heat up things. The laser pistol is, and I like this kind of thing, but is 2d8 damage plus AC of target creature. I think, excluding dex calculations. So basically, just the more lightly armored you are, the more it hurts you. The needler pistol is a thing where you can either do a tight spray of these needles hitting them, or and the needles are, the max damage is dictated by the AC of the target creature to a degree, or you can do a broad beam, and you think that's, again, just once you've worked it out, that's fun. It feels, and the detail is not excessive. The fact that you have several paragraphs is fine, because this is a special event. The paralysis pistol, grenades, power armor, quite detailed stuff on power armor, half page here. Again, that's fun. Players will recognize some of it as well. The power armor is more obvious, but how long will it work? We'll find out. The fact that you're going to have players, and I think this is why actually as a tournament module in the 70s for often experienced players it made sense. As a one-shot now, it doesn't feel like it does make sense. And I say that because what if you've had players who have played D&D a little bit, but I feel like the leap of genre becomes less valuable as a Saturday night special kind of thing. And it is more than that, but just to put in that context, there's something here that feels really satisfying as part of a campaign. It wasn't originally written as a campaign module. It was a Castle Greyhawk sublevel, Gygax's spaceship, with help from Kuntz to populate it. But it feels like, and I think I'll see it in this way, as just a really fun thing in my Greyhawk campaign. The idea that out there are bits of a spaceship, and it fits into that fallen universe theme of Gygax, that maybe Greyhawk is a post-apocalyptic world. Certainly, he sees, pre-Spelljammer, he is happy to imagine that out there are aliens, and it comes up in a few other places too, as well as there's Tharasdon and Cthulhu stuff, of course. the final comment on the tech actually is that it is self-limited. I've already mentioned that, but because things can break, because some stuff can't be recharged, because there are a limited number of power disks and the power disks aren't replicable, unless maybe you can find this other half that is presumably out there, it means they're more like wands than like magic swords. This is not like a flame tongue sword or something. These weapons are like wands, and they are modelled like wands, but with a distinctive ammo system, not via someone enchanting them, but via finding the ammo. Again, where multiplying, why don't I put the quote marks on multiplying magic systems works, I like it with psionics too. I think when you give players a different way to interact with the world, that is usually a good thing, not a bad thing, but it's similar enough to something else that it is not galaxy or reality breaking. You don't have to get disenchanters out there to eat their stuff. Instead, all that happens is their stuff eventually runs out, and they can't use it anymore, and that's a good move. So I think, in conclusion, I've given a few very small critiques. Beyond maybe, is it as applicable in all campaigns at all times? No, but then again, nothing is. This is just more limited than others because the value of the genre blend becomes more intense the more experienced you are in, say, in a Greyhawk first edition campaign, which I have one of. But I think the fact that there are a few things like, you might need to highlight the text a bit and know where things are, or a couple of these, like that lurker above down in the there's a couple of traps like that actually. To be fair, that's a particular thing, that there are a couple of repetitions like that. But there's like this half dozen encounters that maybe were fun in 1976 but feel stayed now. That's not substantive. We are talking about something where we're talking about a really very good module that creates most of the encounters, the way the sci-fi imagery and technology of a pulp era sci-fi module are brought into D&D. The way that lots of individual encounters are just designed, and whether that's Kuntz or Gygax, the specific one doesn't matter, but the whole product is so good for that. And as a way of offering a different view on how D&D can run, maybe that's the last thing, is that this is an early experiment along with Cthulhu stuff in Against the Giants and Tharasdan. Obviously it's Tharasdan is technically the character, but along with those, it is an early sign that D&D is not just you go into a hole in the ground and kill monsters, but is this broader world or broader genre concept where things can be mashed up. And I think that's an Appendix N concept as well. So yeah, I highly recommend having a read of it and getting ideas from it. And tell me what you think in terms of having run it, and in terms of, I guess, generally how you see that genre blending going on. Tell me in the comments. Till next time.